Hey, y'all. As a growing family, my husband and I love game night, especially when it's Wayfair edition.
Let's do it. You gotta name as many Wayfair furniture and decor categories as you can. Ready? Go.
Sofas, bar stools, beds, ottomans, outdoor seating, bookshelves, kitchen tables, garden sheds, mid-century modern lamps.
Time. Nice. You got 9 out of a lot. Not too bad. Keep practicing by visiting wayfair.com, where you can shop every style for every home.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 382 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Stephen White, archaeologist at Archaeology Southeast, UCL. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When you picture a Shakespeare play, you likely imagine a continuous performance, scene following scene, act following act, until the final bow. But in Shakespeare's lifetime, especially at indoor theaters like the Blackfriars, plays weren't always presented without a pause. Candlelight, used to illuminate the stage, had to be trimmed, replaced, and even relit during performances, which meant intentional gaps were built into the show itself. These intervals weren't just practical, they were part of the theatrical experience, inviting music, moments of reflection, and a rhythm that modern audiences rarely consider. Today, we're diving into this largely overlooked aspect of early modern theater called the interval. What did it look like? What happened during an interval? And how did it influence the pacing and experience of Shakespeare's plays? To help us explore this topic, we're delighted to welcome Mark Hutchings, whose latest research shines a spotlight on the physical and performative realities of candlelit stages and their intervals for the 16th and 17th centuries. Dr. Mark Hutchings is a scholar of Renaissance and early modern theater. Following a 4-year Spanish government research fellowship held at the University of Salamanca, he now teaches at the University of Valladolid, and he is a visiting research fellow at the University of Reading, where he taught for 20 years. His work delves into the nuanced realities of stage production during Shakespeare's lifetime, and his recent published research called Approaching the Interval in the Early Modern Theater re-examines how something as simple as a pause, an interval, could dramatically shape the theater experience. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to remind you that there is bonus visual content available for you if you'd like to follow along while you listen to the show. You can log in on our show notes page to see diagrams of candle technology, period references to stage lighting, and excerpts from music fragments that help set the scene during intervals. Head over to casticash.com/episode 382 to access these extras while you listen to the show. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Mark. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, Cassidy. Thank you very much for the invitation.
How are the formats for plays in terms of performance structure? How are they different between indoor versus outdoor playhouses?
Well, the principal difference is that outdoors, the narrative of the fiction continued from the beginning of the play to the end of the play, whereas indoors, we had what we would call today 4 intervals that were rather more complicated than the intervals that we are familiar with today. So that the structure of performance was different, and this had what I think are really important ramifications for how plays were designed and how plays, perhaps most importantly, moved between outdoor and indoors.
You've noted that the use of artificial lighting indoors led to something really fundamental in theater history, the invention of the interval. Can you walk us through how candle technology helped shape this development?
The interval, it seems, was in many ways an accident of technology. And this is where understanding how the indoor theatre worked or requires a kind of reevaluation of our understanding of performance structure, and something we're going to come on to talk about in a little while, the 5-act structure that we're all familiar with today. The problem, and it was a problem for which the interval is a solution, The problem was simply that early modern candles, made as they were of animal fat chiefly, could not last for an entire performance. So it is simply for that reason that the interval or breaks in the action were needed so that the candles could be tended to, mended, perhaps changed altogether. But that is the origin of the interval. It's not the end of the story by any means, because the playhouse culture comes to make use of the interval in terms that we would regard as not so much technological as aesthetic and creative. But nonetheless, that is the reason that we have intervals. And it's chiefly the reason why the indoor theatre is different from the outdoor theatre. Outdoors, of course, plays were lit by sunshine, or at least natural light, let's say, in England, which might not have. Whereas indoors, the candles were required. There were windows in indoor theatres. But if you think about the structure of the Tudor halls, these windows were quite high up and they only admitted a certain amount of natural light. There's been a debate, I think, really an ongoing debate about how important candles were. In other words, were they absolutely essential or did they play a smaller role? R.B. Graves, who has written the most thorough examination of lighting in Shakespearean theatre, he argues that candles were less important in the indoor theatre, that there was a lot of natural light. And that might have been the case in some theatres, but of course wasn't the case at night when theatres required candlelight, absolutely, with no other alternative light source. So that is really the origin. The limitations as we would see it today in candle technology. And looking much further into the future, lighting technology, of course, plays a really important role in the evolution of dramatic structure in the Western theatre right up to the present.
There's a strong correlation, I think, between the use of intervals and the emergence of what we think of as the 5-act structure in printed plays. How did indoor performance spaces influence that format? And where does the classical model from Horace come into play for this conversation?
To some extent, this is a chicken and egg question, because I think what does happen is that certainly the 5-act structure comes to be adopted. It does not come before the candles, if you like. The candles are the origin. 5-act structure is a solution to that problem. Horace doesn't say very much about the 5-act structure, but what he says was enough to influence Renaissance thinkers. When the Roman drama was, as it were, rediscovered in 16th century England, and when it became a staple of grammar school education, and it did so, of course, through printed texts, these Roman plays were printed with a 5-act structure. Part of the examination of this question, going back certainly to the 20th century, when scholars were asking the question, why is it, especially with Shakespeare, why is it some plays are divided into 5 acts and others are not? All sorts of solutions to this issue were presented. But this was very much an author-centered approach in terms of a methodology or a paradigm, rather than a theatre-focused approach. So, for example, Thomas Kidd and Christopher Marlowe, both educated in grammar schools, of course, Kidd at Merchant Taylors, Marlowe at King's School, Canterbury, they would have encountered plays at school which were, first of all, based on the classical model, especially if they were Roman drama, and secondly, performed indoors. So it was often thought that someone like Marlowe or Kidd would compose with a 5-act structure in mind. And I think there's still some mileage in that idea that a classically educated schoolboy who goes on to become a playwright would be thinking in those terms. But ultimately, the 5-act play only really comes into being in terms of performance indoors rather than outdoors. Otherwise, we might ask ourselves the question, why is it that apparently in the outdoor theatres, the amphitheatres, a 5-act structure was not observed? as we'll move through some of these other issues that we're going to talk about today, it may well be that later on in our period, in perhaps the second, third, fourth decade of the 17th century, that the amphitheatre did adapt the classical structure. But I think the key to how indoor plays were structured really starts with the candle. And then they had a ready-made model. It's going to become much more complicated as we think through some of those issues about how that 5-act structure actually operated. We mustn't assume necessarily that candles were changed at each of the 4 act breaks, for example. But we can, I think, make some reasonably educated guesses that the 5-act structure becomes central to the making of plays, but not because of Horace, or only incidentally or indirectly because of Horace, mainly because it was required as a result of the limitations of candle technology.
We often think of play texts as fixed, but you've pointed out that when plays moved between indoor and outdoor spaces, they often had to be adapted for the different location. What does that process of adapting a play from one location to another look like in practical terms?
Well, we are fortunate. There is one specific play, and this is in this case, it moves from indoors to outdoors. And the reason we can find some quite useful evidence from this particular play is because it exists in what I think probably most scholars would agree is both its original indoor iteration and its outdoor iteration. And that play is John Marston's The Malcontent. And this was a play that Marston wrote for a children's company. And in circumstances we're not entirely sure about, it was then taken subsequently, possibly later in the same year, but not long after it was first composed for the indoor theatre, by the newly anointed or appointed Kingsmen for performance at Shakespeare's, at the Globe, slipping into Shakespeare's Globe there. And what's interesting is that this play was printed 3 times in 1604. And the first 2 quartos, Q1 and Q2, show all the hallmarks of an indoor play. Its famous induction, referring, in fact, to these, if not the circumstances of the transfer, the fact of that transfer, and alluding to some of the changes that the Kingsmen carry out. So here we have a play that is shorter, staged indoors, with intervals and with music, and then is actually shortened in terms of the intervals with the music, so that the Kingsmen, for interval, and they take away the intervals and they add, it's about 25%. And it's really quite interesting because one of the advantages, I'm going to come on to talk a little bit about the disadvantages of using the word interval. Interval is something that there's a whole range of opinion about the usefulness of the interval, or, sometimes that it takes away the momentum of the play in the performance and so on and so forth. Whether early modern playmakers were irritated by the interval as such, as a structural aspect of the play, is not really clear. But what is clear is that they could use it to expand their options in terms of choreography. There's a kind of rule that most scholars are very familiar with, and any reader of a play from this period will immediately recognize it, and that is the so-called law of re-entry. And it's the idea that when a character exits the stage at the end of a scene, it is to go somewhere else. And it would look odd if they then re-entered at the beginning of the next scene, there being no gap in the amphitheatre between the end of scene 3 and the beginning of scene 4. So this was a restriction in the amphitheatre, and we can see how amphitheatre playwrights, or at least plays written for the amphitheatre, have various techniques of getting around this. What the interval made possible, a character could exit at the end of one act and enter at the beginning of the next. And in fact, this detail, if you like, which is not really visible actually this becomes a telltale sign of theatre provenance. So that as a consequence, if we examine Q3 Malcontent alongside Q1 and Q2, these scenes are required because with the interval having been removed, two different characters would actually re-enter having immediately just exited. Principally, it has a structural function. We have the intervals removed, but sometimes material added. If we were to go in the other direction, then of course, what a playmaker has to do, or what a member of the company might do, or even the author, if in the case of Shakespeare, the author is a member of the company, they would then have to take the text of the amphitheatre play, divide it into however many scenes it is, and find 4 points in the action where intervals could be inserted. Now, this is really quite important, I think, for our understanding of how repertories worked. We habitually, all of us, use the terms synonymously, partly to avoid repeating the word play all the time. But really, if we talk about a play called The Malcontent, we then need to talk about, I think, the texts, plural, of The Malcontent, of which we have 3, indicating the different provenance and the different performance structure. For the most part, of course, we don't have that bibliographic luxury of an indoor and outdoor version in the folio compared to the earlier quarto texts. I think there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done in this area about the length of plays in different playhouses and so on and so forth. But adaptation would be a normal procedure for, I think, most companies. A company going on tour is going to use an amphitheatre company, let's say a troupe such as the Strangers or Admiral's Men or Pembroke's Men or whoever in the 1590s. When they went on tour, they would also operate indoors. So they must have been used to making these adjustments. From what I can see, they kept the adjustments to the actual script, at least when they were going from outdoors to indoors, to a minimum. That's a hypothesis at the moment that's only supported by 1 or 2 examples that I can give you.
One of the most striking differences indoors seems to be the actual experience of the interval itself, especially with music, candle trimming, and I think there was even like dancing happening on stage. What exactly would have been going on during an interval? And when we say that they contribute to the theater experience, what would that have been like for the audience?
The interval is an absolute suspension of any kind of play, any kind of theatrical performance. Part of the reason for that is architecture, and there is the introduction of the curtain that separates the audience from the stage space, because this means that the interval can be a complete break in the action, and indeed the audience can leave the auditorium and so on and so forth. The interval is always visible. In other words, there isn't a curtain falling that indicates that the interval is happening. So the purpose of the interval, as we've established, is principally to attend to the candles, the wax or oil or grease dripping onto these the very expensive costumes, candles of smoke. That would have been an issue. So while the candles are being changed if they needed to be, but the main point being that there is an opportunity to attend to the candles without going on the stage while the play is continuing. Music features Dancing Boy. So there was a kind of interact entertainment, if you like, on the stage. There are also several plays that, to different degrees, satirize this. So The Night of the Burning Pestle, 2 plays by Ben Jonson, are not his best-known plays, where Jonson has a real glee at the stage sitters, and he's making fun of them. And we do have some autobiographical material on this, where a playgoer recalls how at the end of every act, he would rise and salute his acquaintances and so on and so forth. So the interval, how far that irritated or didn't signify for other members of the audience, who knows? But the interval is a complex moment. The early moderns didn't use the word interval at all, and this is posed for me one of the problems of talking about this. The term they used was a term that's not very useful for us, the act time. And it's confusing because it doesn't mean the time during the act, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at all. It means the time in between the acts. So it means the interval time.
You're mentioning that there are early modern records of people who were standing and saluting and sort of, being the center of attention themselves while they were on stage. But how long did they have to take advantage of that space? If they had paid extra to sit up there, about how long was this interval of time?
That's a great question. The short answer to that is that we don't really know. No, it seems that there was a degree of flexibility during these intervals.
I've always liked to think that I know that they sold hazelnuts and there were other kind of snacks that have been uncovered at the, I'm thinking of the archaeological dig they did at the Rose, for example. They uncovered a whole lot of hazelnut shells and all this. I like to think that during the interval, people were getting snacks and there was probably music going on and getting up and walking around, talking, to your friends. And then there would be some kind of cue that would let you know, okay, you need to come back to where you were standing, or if you were fortunate enough to have, seats, come back to where you were sitting and watch, and the show is going to continue on, which is so similar to the way that a theater experience is today, that I like that connection between how it is now and the way it might have been for Shakespeare's lifetime.
Yes, absolutely. And there has recently been reports of quite a few audience behavior in the theatre that might seem to be more, I don't know, more similar to how people might have behaved then. It might have been much more fluid, like they're at a sports match, for example. One other thing I should say about the music, the theatre historians are clear that music was particularly important at the indoor theatres. And of course, the children's companies, they were originally choristers, so they were adept at song and musical accomplishment. So that in some ways, the interval is not just a kind of gap, in most cases, a gap in the scripted play narrative, which of course is really to do with characters exchanging dialogue and so on and so forth, but a continuation of the musical environment. Play would begin and most probably end with some kind of musical performance. And then the music would give way to Act 1. And then the music would come back and then give way again to Act 2 and so on. People must have gone to the theatre for all sorts of things. And perhaps some people went for the music rather than for the play, and they might see the intervals as the play itself rather than the intervals. This, in fact, raises another question about music, what kind of music was played. Again, John Marston is helpful as far as it goes. With his play Sophonisba, he doesn't give us the actual music. As far as I'm aware, none of the music has survived for the intervals.
Sounds like it was a very social time, really. The intervals, it's almost a function in and of itself. You might actually go to the theater for the opportunity to connect with whoever else was going to be going to the theater.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think there's no doubt. And certainly as we move into the Jacobean and Caroline period, clearly theatre going becomes a cultural thing to do, not just because people are going to the indoor theatre, which is rather more sophisticated and more expensive, but also it means that going to a play is not regarded as a kind of low-level popular kind of entertainment that we might find in the 1580s and 1590s. With the music, the unanswerable question is, to what extent was the music generic? Sometimes, perhaps, chosen to fit the mood at a certain point in a play. And with Sophonisba, Marston, if he is responsible for the musical information, specifies different instruments at different intervals and also specifies whether it should be loud music or soft music. Again, I think as in most facets of scholarship on this period, we always have to try to resist the temptation to move from the specific to the general and arrive at conclusions based on only one or two examples.
If you're looking back at these surviving texts, the quarto versions of these plays, to investigate the history of intervals, and they didn't call them intervals at this time period, what are you looking for specifically? Because you indicated that it might not always be between acts. So if it's not reliable that every time there was a shift between acts, there would also be an interval, how are you identifying, oh, here was an interval that occurred and here's what instruments that they played? I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds like the playwright might have had something intentional where they said, I want these instruments to be played and I want this music to be played. Is that written in the scripts? I think is what I'm asking.
I'm saying that there is some sort of interval at every act break. We know from a large number of plays, actually from the King's Men, 30 years of the 17th century, from the acquisition of the Blackfriars, 1642. Actually, more than half of these plays use the interval so that a character can exit at the end of, say, Act 2 and re-enter at the beginning of Act. It's fairly clear that the 5-act structure is how it was used. Obviously, its principal safety function, if you like, was so the candles could be looked at. But there was a whole range of practice, it seems.
You've given us such a clear picture of how intervals worked in theater for Shakespeare's lifetime. And I know that we're excited to learn more about these and how they worked. If we wanted to explore this subject on our own, where should we begin? If we're brand new, where should we start to learn more?
For those in Britain, to go to the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse and get a sense of how these indoor plays worked. Our problem, I think, is that because the amphitheatre is obviously so iconographic and so unusual, and of course it disappears in the 17th century, that it's become our kind of default model, and the indoor performance culture has sort of been lost, even though indoor performance predates the amphitheatre production of the 1560s and 70s and up to 1642.
It's excellent advice. It was a wonderful experience for me to go to the American Shakespeare Center. And while I've not had the pleasure of going to the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse, I've heard it is fantastic. So definitely we will place links to these in the show notes for you to check out those. And if you're interested in some of the music that would have been played in Shakespeare's lifetime, perhaps for some of these intervals, we will place links to some related episodes that explore that side of this part of performance. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find these. Now, Mark, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
My heart sank when I read this question, because I thought, however difficult it is to try and get one's head around intervals, this kind of question is. And in the end, I opted for Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, the 3-volume version. I have an interest in what is sometimes called travel literature, but if I were on the desert island, it would be a kind of torture to read about these often disastrous voyages that Hakluyt put together.
I can see where that would be your selection. I can make that work. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm continuing to pull the thread on this material, because the very short book that I wrote about the interval, I thought it would be plenty in terms of the number of words I was allocated. But in fact, that is often the case.
We'll look forward to seeing your future work come to life. These sounds like exciting things and so much fun to dive into. Thank you so much, Mark Hutchings, for being here this week and helping us understand the role of the interval for Shakespeare's lifetime. We appreciate you being here to share it with us.
So much, Cassidy. I've really enjoyed it. It's been very generous of you.
That wraps up our look at the role of intervals in early modern theater. A special thank you to Dr. Mark Hutchings for sharing his insights into how Candlelight and the pauses it required shaped Shakespeare's stage. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Hutchings and explore the resources he recommends, visit the show notes today at cassidycash.com/episode 382. You'll also find bonus material there available exclusively for patrons, including images of period lighting, theater interiors, and artifacts from the indoor playhouses of Shakespeare's lifetime, including the Blackfriars. And if you're not ready to step off the stage just yet, you can dive even further into the history of indoor theaters when you join Experience Shakespeare on Patreon. Inside, you'll find a hands-on activity kit waiting for you that teaches you how to make your own tapered beeswax candles, just like those that were used to light the Blackfriars stage. You'll dip the wax, set the wicks, and step straight into the world of 16th century stagecraft. To access this activity, visit the show notes page at cassidycash.com/episode 382, click the Patreon button, and select Experience Shakespeare to get started. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your stage be well lit, your intervals thoughtfully placed, and your candles burn long and bright. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.